Hello there, this is Critical from Critical Media. Just taking a look, or should I say celebrating, the 2024 Legends Omnibus release of Star Wars, The New Republic, Volume 2. Or more so, the Heir to the Empire and Dark Empire Omnibus. And what we usually do at this channel is give you an idea of what to expect if you ever come across these books in the wild. So we go over the exterior, some bonus material, art and plot points, and then a brief review at the end, or sometimes a recommendation, which, to be honest, I'm just going to get this part out of the way right now. Get this book. This is 100% the most important Star Wars book you're probably ever going to come across. So sure, thankfully they have actually announced that they're reprinting, some of these in the trade paperback. So yes, there's the Heir to the Empire trade that's coming out in the Epic collections, and they're also planning to reprint the Dark Empire trade or Epic collection. And for eagle-eyed observers of the channel, you may recall it was actually the very first book I ever did on the channel, at least comic book wise. So I guess it's all come full circle here. And yeah, and the reason why I guess I'm calling it more of a celebration is many years ago when I was younger, essentially the only kind of comic books I was reading, aside from Captain Marvel in the early 90s, was Star Wars comics, because I was a Star Wars fan. I wasn't really reading anything else. So basically from the 90s up until like the mid 2000s, when I really got into the genre of comic books in general, these stories were pretty much like the king, hands down. And it was always done by Dark Horse. Dark Horse, who did incredible work when it came to telling Star Wars stories. But anywho, I guess we'll kind of jump into the nature of our channel here. So at least in terms of the exterior here, we have the Dave Dorman cover. As you can see, it definitely harkens to the film covers and whatnot. Very awesome in that light. And very similar to the Volume 1 release here. Very similar stylings in that sense. And similar to the, I guess, Epic collections that they were releasing, it has a very similar aesthetic on the I guess on the rear on this book here. But pretty impressive nonetheless. But at least underneath the dust jacket, yeah, we have that awesome Mathieu Lefray cover. I'll just show the rear of it first, because I always loved the way Thrawn looked in this image. So menacing and so perfect. One of the few times you actually even see Kashyyyk and other planets like Makir and all that. Pretty awesome. And it's a pretty big boy. I think it's, just over 1,000, but still pretty impressive what we're getting in this particular release. But I guess before we get to the beginning and find out what's inside, let's just take a look at some bonus material here. I do appreciate that for some stories they do have some bonus material attached to it, like the Boba Fett stories. They kind of have the covers linked to those. But very similar to other Legends books, they have the Star Wars handbooks nearby with all these awesome factoids about the characters you've seen. But one thing I appreciate about Marvel is what they've decided to include. So some of these are actually from different Star Wars handbooks or assortments. They just include the characters that are involved with the story predominantly. But yeah, hands down, my favorite single image of Luke Skywalker ever. The most badass image, I'd say. So incredible. Anytime I think of like Luke Skywalker being like the one, I think of that image for some reason. Just super awesome. And yeah, you're kind of seeing these European designs as well. And of course the Mike Stackpole. I love the fact that they interviewed him for this one. But you're kind of seeing these European covers, and you're probably wondering, okay, it's pretty cool to have, but why do they have it? There's actually an intriguing aspect for those who know about this. When we got this release, one thing I appreciate about Marvel is they gave us the original North American issues that came out. The thing about them was Luke's lightsaber is blue for some reason. But some European releases actually corrected that, and his lightsaber is green in these. So I don't know, I just find it kind of an intriguing factoid that they included the European covers this time around. Very awesome in that light. But now, at least onto the, I guess, art and plot points, which for a Legends book, I guess it's always wise to take a look at the, I guess, material, the table of contents. And remember, folks, this is not so much a Marvel book. This is a Dark Horse Comics book. Just Marvel assembled it. As usual with the Legends books I've mentioned, the one thing I big Marvel up especially for is the way they choose to map these books. Because yeah, some of them are published, much later, but the stories happen, chronologically earlier. So I appreciate that Marvel actually considers that when they do this. So a very intriguing point is like the way Heir to the Empire, the comic, was released versus when the novel was released. That kind of jazz. But very intriguing stuff nonetheless. But one thing I love about the way Marvel has been printing these, they use a lot of those Star Wars Tales issues. Basically, those were like just Dark Horse saying, writer, you can write any kind of story. We'll just plot it wherever it is, wherever it was supposed to happen in the chronology. And that's kind of what I like about Marvel. They kind of sandwich these stories in between in the right places, But one of the highlights of this book as well is that they included the JABBA tape. The JABBA tape basically is an AI. But it's an intriguing story where there's a whole bunch of people fighting over, JABBA's inheritance, particularly Gorga the Hutt, as well as these two bikers, these skiff bikers. Swoop riders, I should say. Gizmond and Spiker, who I always loved Spiker's design, or at least his helmet design. So awesome. And they're all vying particularly for this very souped up, state-of-the-art ship that JABBA had as an escape ship, basically. But I like how this story plays out, because it's basically like a heist story. It has a nice bit of comedy through this character here, this very loyal character. The whole AI aspect of it, very intriguing. Everybody's after the particular inheritance, but they're all after it for different reasons. It's a very poignant kind of story. I love the fact that it was written the way it was. Super awesome. But even in that respect, yeah, you're still getting more of these characters. They must have been popular enough that they kept getting stories, these two, Gizmond and Spiker. I'm not going to call Gizmond his other name. But yeah, you're seeing all these epic legends things, like the original Dark Troopers that now Disney has actually adopted. That kind of stuff, Very intriguing that they did that. And a little bit more of the Star Wars Tales. Personally, I love this one, Marooned. Basically about these two leftover soldiers from the Battle of Endor that just they got lost and never got picked up. So one Imperial Stormtrooper, or Scout Trooper, and one Rebel. And they just end up having to kind of make do and survive together. So very intriguing narrative, that's for sure. But, even before we get into the meat and potatoes, one of my favorites out there. There is this awesome Mara Jade story. As a matter of fact, I know her more from this story than any others. Even though Volume 1 has her series in it. I remember when I was a kid, this was like probably the first Mara Jade story I ever read. Her and Crix Maydeen, who I remember especially from the video game and the films, of course. But yeah, very much nails exactly the core of her character. She's basically an assassin. She has an incredible sense of duty, even beyond death. She's still the Emperor's hand, the number one assassin for the Emperor. But yeah, super awesome series, as you're kind of seeing. Very detailed artwork and a very dense story, as you can kind of tell with these dialogue boxes. But now comes one of the main stars of the show. So this is the Heir to the Empire series. So as I kind of mentioned, Heir to the Empire, this is actually an adaptation of the novel. Right, that was written in like the early 90s. And this comic series, adapted by Mike Baron, it came out in the later 90s, like literally around the time I became such a huge Star Wars fan. And what a perfect time to jump in, right? But yeah, this takes place about 4 or 5 years after Return of the Jedi, essentially. And you're instantly introduced to Thrawn, how awesome he is these, the species here, the Nokri, his like personal assassin guild, so to speak. He already has these machinations to stop the Jedi. He's already like hunting for these creatures that basically negate the Force. They're called Salamiri. Super awesome. And you're instantly introduced to like how menacing of a character he can be and how calculated he is. The whole him, loving art aspect. That's not something that Dave Filoni figured out. That's something that already existed in Legends. Go figure. That's one thing about Disney Star Wars. They kept borrowing so much from Legends, especially these two stories that we're going over here. But essentially, yeah, you're getting a lot of these characters growing. Like, this is Luke just before he becomes a Grand Master, essentially. Or accepts the title, I should say. But yeah, he's going through his own kind of logic, or should I say his own doubts. You have Han, who can't accept the fact that he's actually considered a good person in the universe now. He's no longer known as the smuggler. He's known as the, the heroic general, and he just can't. He can't accept that. I love that about him. He's still Han Solo at the end of the day. I love that. He is my favorite character in Star Wars personally. That's another thing about Star Wars. He didn't start out that way for me. But yeah, the introduction of course, Talon Karrde and Mara Jade for this story. I'd say Mara Jade, I knew her from the story, but I didn't know her machinations until that issue a little bit later. But yeah, such a sweet series. But as you're kind of seeing as the story progresses, you're kind of seeing this like sense of like a lot of pieces moving around, like it's a very busy story. It plays a lot like a film, actually. And there's that blue lightsaber thing I mentioned earlier. It can get pretty bloody as well, pretty hectic. Even Thrawn's kind of like that. I love this moment particularly when you see Han like actually take down a ship that looks a lot like the Falcon, and then you find out only he knows for a fact it's not the Falcon. He knows his ship so well. Love that. Such an epic little thing. But aside from that, these stories, Heir to the Empire and Dark Empire, they're kind of split up into 3 parts. So this is the first part here, so this is the Heir to the Empire titled story. And, then it has its sequel, Dark Force Rising, and then the final part, The Last Command. But one thing I always loved about these is that they always showed you aspects of the Star Wars universe that you didn't always think of, or little things you may have always wanted to know, like how can a starfighter board a ship like this? Sometimes they have other ways of docking. It's pretty impressive that they actually go over stuff like that. Absolutely love it in that sense. And yeah, the art does kind of change in between the series. So this is like the middle part. This is the Dark Force Rising series. This is surprisingly done by Terry Dodson. And you kind of see Leia's pregnant with her twins. That's kind of how you get the semblance of time throughout this series. But I have to admit, Terry Dodson's art in this series was super sweet. Like it's a far more, I guess, penciled than what you kind of get from him these days. But still, awesome stuff. And yeah, they always make that character, Sabayoth, really rise out of this book. That deranged dark Jedi that you get out of this story. Honestly, I like the battle, the little power struggle between him and Thrawn. Thrawn always seems to have an ace up his sleeve the whole time. He just lets this deranged Jedi just continue to be arrogant throughout it. And by the way, when you read this story, you're going to probably end up not liking this guy either. Sabayoth. Admittedly, when I was younger, I called him Kaboth. Only 3 interviews many years later, you find out the right way, right? But yeah, such a sweet story. And then, of course, the finale with, of course, The Last Command. I can always tell whenever the art changes like that. Such an awesome build-up. This one feels a lot like Return of the Jedi. You'll read it and be like, yeah, even the ending kind of feels, yeah, how can that not remind you of Return of the Jedi right there, right? Such a sweet series, though. One of my favorite things, period. Let's just put it that way. But essentially right after that, so now comes Dark Empire, which takes place basically a year later. So if we're thinking from Return of the Jedi, the Heir to the Empire is like 4 or 5 years after, and this is 6 years after Return of the Jedi. But yeah, basically, unlike that film Rise of Skywalker, at least this has a better explanation of how the Emperor came back. Or at least doesn't just abruptly say it. At least introduces it properly. But you're kind of noticing with this particular story, this is from like the early 90s. So it does have a lot of that one-tone art style. They kind of did that to save money. After all, Dark Horse wasn't the biggest comic book company. But it kind of gives it this lasting, timeless look. It personally, at least for me. You'll kind of notice how this page kind of stays fuchsia, and this one has this red-blue aesthetic throughout not just this panel, but even the panels that follow. But one thing I always loved about this series is how much of a badass they made Luke. Like, nothing can affect him. AT-AT, doesn't matter. He'll take it down with like it's nothing. But you keep getting the sense that Luke is like drifting more and more into the dark side. Definitely love some of the imagery in this book and some of the ground that's covered. Yeah, even these world devastators and the TIE D fighters, basically the automated TIE fighters. There you go. Already being introduced as early as then. Oh yeah, TIE D, drone fighters, excuse me. But yeah, the World Devastators, yeah, that's not something Disney came up with. It once again originates from Legends. It's something you'll notice when you read this book, how a lot of the ideas that Disney had turned out not to be original at all. They fully grabbed the ideas and inspirations from this book. But yeah, just loving seeing this like darker version of Luke, because this is a story where he drifts more and more into the dark side to try and get in close with the Emperor. This is, of course, written at a time even before the idea of the Sith were even created. They always used to call them Dark Jedi back in the day. But still, I just love all the history behind this, believe me. You know, the emergence of Leia becoming powerful in her own right. It's pretty sweet in that sense. Man, I love this story. But yeah, it just essentially, there's always going to be some sort of world-destroying weapon, right? In this one, it's the Galaxy Gun. Basically a missile that you can fire at any point and it'll just destroy a planet. It travels so damn fast, essentially. But essentially the Emperor, this time coming back through cloning, he keeps having to grab more and more bodies, more clone bodies, because his essence keeps burning off each body. So his master plan is to try and take Leia's children, basically, and try and take over their bodies to try and live longer. I think this is at a time where Anakin Solo is coming around, so it's pretty sweet in that sense. But yeah, you're just seeing some pretty impressive artwork here. Man, I love this series so much. Yeah, it's definitely your more than different take on your typical art styles and kind of expectations of the Star Wars lore. And yes, you are getting more so like the introduction of the whole FETT syndicate and all that jazz that eventually comes about. But man, I love this series. The whole Vima Boda thing, the Cam Solasar aspect. Yeah, that's him right there, Cam. Another Jedi that Luke found. He actually saves from the dark side, so to speak. Man, the whole planet of Ossus thing. Man, you will love this book so much, because it really does feel complete when you read it. It really is episodes 7 and 8 that we're basically just going through right there. But amazing work that was done. And probably one of my favorite parts of this particular Omni is that they kind of dedicated the final pages to all those dope Boba Fett stories that Dark Horse was doing. So yeah, this Twin Engines of Destruction, this is like him versus Jodo Cast. Honestly, I remember Jodo Cast from the that fighting game back on the PlayStation. The Masters of Terakasi, or Terakasai, whatever they pronounce it. Man, I love this particular story, though, because that character, Jodo Cast from the game, is pretty much like his rival in this story. And it's super sweet, because it references the whole Jaster Muriel, a.k.a. you can kind of say Boba Fett's grandfather. You know, it represents so much of the history that eventually gets adapted. So sweet, man. And even the fact that you get returning artists like John Nadeau, who would just keep doing Star Wars comics, like even into Rogue Squadron years later. Man, I love this series so much. Man, all these books are just so damn perfect. But yeah, this is not even a recommendation of whether you should or shouldn't. This is simply, you must get this book. Hands down, the #1 Star Wars book ever. If I ever do Star Wars lists, this will always probably end up as #1. Thankfully, it doesn't really have any printing errors that I've come across. I've actually managed to read it so quickly once it showed up. But man, absolutely pick this book up. The single most important Star Wars book you'll ever get. You don't even need to get Volume 1. You could just simply get Volume 2 and have it on your shelf and say, yes, I have a legitimate piece of Star Wars history. But hey, that's just my 2 cents, not my little 2 cents. Admittedly, that's a lot of my cents in this video here. But yeah, this is I'm smiling the entire time I'm doing this, because so much joy was created by Marvel, at least assembling it in one book for people to grab. Yes, you can eventually grab these trades that are coming out, because they finally are printing the Heir to the Empire again. So you can kind of own them in a trade paperback form. But at least this one package, you get a little bit more out of it. And it's just ultra perfect. I can't recommend this beyond 2 thumbs up. If I had 3 arms, I'd give another thumbs up. Hey, who? That's just me. I would love to see your comments down below, as always. Y'all folks take care, and definitely pick up this book. And I'll see you guys in the next video.